My name is Felipe Monteiro. I'm a professor of strategy at the INSEAD. And today I have with me Marcos Troijo. Marco has expertise in many fields. He was the president of the New Development Bank. He was also deputy Minister of Economy for Brazil and also special secretary for international trade. And we are delighted because Marcos has recently joined INSEAD. He's a distinguished fellow of the Hoffman Global Institute for Business and Society. So, Marco, delighted to have you here today with us because we're going to be talking about something which is very close to your heart and your expertise, this new phase of globalization. So, welcome, Marcos.
Thank you very much, Felipe. A great honor to be here with you, and I'm privileged now to be part of the Hoffman Global Institute for Business and Society. And yes, Felipe, I do think that we are walking towards a new chapter of globalization. I think it's a very important concept because one of the key reasons why we can explain why nations rise or fall in recent times is whether they're able to adapt to the contours of globalization. So I think from the fall of the Berlin Wall all the way to the fall of Lehman Brothers, we've experienced a phase of deep globalization, free international trade, an attachment to free markets, free competition, the notion that the rule of law and representative democracies were the way to go. But for the past 15 years, we've been inside this trend towards deglobalization. So more obstacles to exports and imports, more restrictions to the flows of foreign direct investment, the rebirth of some import substitution policies, and the world has underperformed in terms of its economy. Now, when you look at the global scenario, you see geopolitical tensions, you see the conflict in the Ukraine, you see inflation still very high. Some say that we're not living in a post-COVID world, but we are living in a with COVID world. It's true that pandemics will be part of the picture for a number of years to come. But these, as I see it, are not the single most important traits of this new chapter of globalization. The new chapter of globalization will be a confluence of four very important drivers. So one, as I've had an opportunity to discuss with our fellow scholars at INSEAD, we are undergoing this sort of change in the tectonic plates of the global economy. And the biggest emerging economies of the world, the E7, so China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Russia, Mexico, and Turkey, now have a combined gross domestic product measured at purchasing power parity terms that's bigger than the traditional G7. As everyone knows, global supply chains and value networks are being rerouted, so the traditional international divisions of labor are also being reconfigured. There is a new age of talent out there. Our common friend, Professor Klaus Schwab, says that talent has become the most important factor of production, so we should be talking about talentism and not only capitalism. And now I see going forward that infrastructure continues to be one of the most exponential factors in driving productivity forward. But infrastructure now is about the merger between the physical world and the digital, the tech-intensive world. So we're talking about this marriage between physical and tech-intensive infrastructure. So this is, say, the outlines, the general characteristics of this next chapter of globalization, to which naturally nation states and companies will have to adapt to.
Thank you, Marcos. I'd like to go back to one of the points that you mentioned, which is this eclipse, right, of somehow having E7 being larger than G7 in PPP terms. But a lot of people say, no, this is only a China story. Is this only a China story?
It's interesting because if we think about the sources or the epicenters of global economic growth in recent decades, we can very clearly see the United States leading the charge in the 50s and the 60s. The 70s and the 80s were very much about Japan, about the so-called Asian tigers. But now we see something that's a little different, Felipe, which is those countries that have big populations, big territories, are the ones where most likely robust growth is going to come from. So yes, the China story has been all over the place for the past 50 years. Maybe one of the most significant miracles in economic history has been that of China since its opening up policy in 1978. So naturally, when we talk about emerging economies, there is a sort of oversized emphasis on the role of China. And no one here wants to downplay how important the rise of China is, to the extent that in PPP terms, China is already the biggest economy in the world. But when we compare the E6 to the E7 with the G7, if all of a sudden from the E7 vertical you move China aside, and on the G7 vertical you move the United States aside, still the E6 is bigger than the G6, once again in combined GDP measured at purchasing power parity, which means that the growth story is about China, but it's beyond China. Look at India, for example. If we look at every year from 2016 all the way to today, with the exception of 2020, which was the most delicate year of the COVID pandemic, India has outgrown China in percentage terms. The economies are still, although India has overtaken China in terms of being the most populous country of the world a couple of weeks ago, China's economy is still about 5 times bigger than that of India. But India, a very important source of growth. The same for Indonesia, and the same for another set of big emerging economies. Look at Egypt. Look at Vietnam. So I see growth really coming in from the E6, and naturally, this creates a new web of potential economic collaboration, where yes, a significant portion of the foreign direct investment will come from traditional sources like Europe, like North America. But it is also true that new centers of global liquidity and global irradiation of investment are going to be part of the picture. Look, for example, at MENA region countries. And trade will also be very impacted by these new realities. I always like to call the attention to the fact that today a country like Brazil does exports more to a country like Malaysia than it does to Italy, more to Thailand than it does to France, more to Singapore than to Germany. So it's a world reconfigured.
Fascinating. And Marcos, as you describe all those new trends in this new chapter of globalization, as we know, a lot of CEOs and chief strategy officers are going back to the drawing board, right, and redesigning their global strategy. So, what do you think those companies and those senior leaders, what they should be considering in order to remain competitive and sustainable in this evolving globalization landscape?
Yeah. I think our whenever the day is cloudy and there's a lot of fog on the road, the trend for drivers is to be extra careful, and I think it's only natural, especially if you're talking about a stretch of years that I say arbitrarily locate from 2008 all the way to today, where deglobalization trends have been very strong. And sometimes when I talk about deglobalization, I'm not talking exactly about the opposite of globalization, but we should understand deglobalization of the past 15 years in the same way that we understand deceleration. So, for example, when a vehicle is decelerating, it doesn't mean that it has stopped, but it means that its progression forward is undergoing in a way that's more careful, that's perhaps slower. But the trend continues. I mean, I think there's no hiding away from globalization. And this is something that I believe CEOs must be aware of. Because if all of a sudden you just retrench, you pull everything back, for example, in terms of your manufacturing plants to your country of origin, there's all this talk now about nearshoring and friendshoring. But you see, what is nearshoring? Is it something that is geographical? Is it a concept that we should only understand in terms of physical proximity? Or is it something that we should understand in terms of logistics, or where it makes sense from the perspective of where the future markets are? So a big question mark around the notion of nearshoring. The same thing is about friendshoring. So how do you define a friend? Some companies understand that perhaps you're better off defining a friend as locating your activity in those countries where you can actually turn out the bigger profit, right? The balance sheet is the most important compass, perhaps, for defining what nearshoring is. But one thing is true, I believe, going forward, which is international investment, cross-border investment, and international trade in the past have been very much marked by tariffs, quota, and I'm not saying that this criteria are going away, but there are new things out there. International trade and investment has become about standards. As you and I have discussed in the past, Felipe, I was one of the negotiators of the European Union Mercosur agreement, and it's really a treaty in terms of association. So there are clauses there that relate to standards. So what kind of intellectual property rules do you have in place? What kind of environmental legislation do you embrace? How do you approach the issue of government procurement as a way to shape how demand is formed? So standards are absolutely important. And obviously there's, as we discussed, a natural trend towards emerging economies becoming the center of economic growth. So this is something that CEOs have to pay very much attention to.
Excellent. Marcos, not too long ago, okay, just a few weeks back, you were the president of a very important multilateral institution, the New Development Bank. And in that capacity, right, you were talking to a number of emerging economies. And it's not only the new chapter in globalization, but also a lot of senior leaders, CEOs, and obviously, kind of public policy. I mean, all those stakeholders are really affected by sustainability and, more broadly speaking, by ESG considerations. So I was wondering, from your experience and more recently at the NDB, how do you see, how can companies in emerging countries align their operations and practices with ESG considerations?
Well, being with the New Development Bank was a very interesting experience, very fruitful for me. I was honored to be in that function. Felipe, more than a decade ago, I set up the BRIC Lab, a Center for Brazil, Russia, and China at Columbia University in New York. So I approached the issue of BRICS with an academic hat, then with a business hat, and then later when I went into government, I chaired the board of directors of the New Development Bank on behalf of Brazil, and later was elected president of that institution. I thought it was very interesting, among other things, because one of the features that you have in the global scenario today is that there is a deficit of international cooperation. Look, for example, in the year 2008, following the Great Recession, following the crisis of the fall of the Lehman Brothers, the subprime crisis, the G20 assembled. There was a lot of joint effort in terms of creating platforms for cooperation that would help each of the world's biggest economies do better on the road forward. Now, I think that scenario is gone. The appetite for cooperation is not to be seen as you would have only a decade and a half ago. So the beautiful thing about multilateral institutions is that they provide the stage upon which you can cooperate in interests, in areas where your interests coincide. So the New Development Bank, it's a young institution, is only about 8 years old. So it was one of the first multilateral entities to have sustainable development goals as part of their own DNA. So while I was president, about 25% of everything that we allocated resources to was related in one way or another to sustainability, to the Paris Agreement, to the Sustainable Development Goals. We've approved, when I was president back in 2022, the new 5-year strategy where we raise that objective to 40% of everything that is financed. So yes, the New Development Bank offers its contribution. It's a very, say, humble one, and when compared to the big needs the world has in this particular sphere. but it's there. And I think another beautiful aspect of multilateral institutions is that sometimes they take the first step in a particular area, and then investments crowd in from other players, from other financial actors. And this is something that is part of the of what the multilateral development institutions are all about. Now, one of the things that I've learned, Felipe, when I was there, more than I learned, I observed, I was an eyewitness to, and I think it's important to share, particularly in the context of the Hoffman Global Institute for Business and Society, is that the very concept, I think, of sustainability and sustainable development is evolving, right? So let us, for example, establish a scale between, say, ecology and economy, right? The way that these two poles are organized is actually being reconfigured. For example, today, yes, we have to pay attention to the environment. We have to facilitate the transition to the green economy. But there's a social aspect in terms, for example, of skilling the labor force, skilling individuals to play an active and productive role in their economic lives throughout the life cycle that contributes to the transition, but does not, say, create an additional element of social exclusion, is something that we have to be absolutely aware of. Sometimes I say that the notion of skilling or reskilling is the new name of sustainability. So how do you equip the human mind to be able to play this new role in the new sustainable development economy, where perhaps the bulk of activities are moving away from manufacturing? You know how much I love to study the origin of words. So manufacturing is something that you do with your hands, to manufacturing. So the transition from manufacturing to manufacturing is definitely one of the most important reference points in terms of how we approach sustainability going forward.
Yeah, I cannot agree more, Marcus. And as you were describing this, I was reminded, right, that last year the Global Talent Competitiveness Index report, right, that both of us have talked about, the focus was exactly on global talent and sustainable development goals. So, I mean, it is very clear that as we think about sustainability, talent, right, and reskilling and the social sustainability is going to be very critical. I wonder, Marcos, if you have examples, if you think about companies, right, and working in the emerging markets in the ESG space, if you have examples of, some of the new practices, things that you observed or have worked with, because some people may have the impression that Europe is leading the sustainability transformation, and what's happening in emerging markets is just a bunch of laggards. Do you share that view, or do you feel there are a lot of things to be learned also from companies in that space in emerging markets?
Yeah. Very interesting question, Felipe. And I think sometimes the concept of ESG has to be adapted to the reality of where the economic or business activity is being performed, so that it adapts to the local circumstances in order to create the most beneficial outcome. Let us be reminded that ESG is environmental, social, and governance. So, for example, in some jurisdictions, the participation of a company, especially a company that has a global nature, will actually provide for an incentive and a benchmark for corporate governance to set in, for relations between management and investors to set in, on the way how the corporations and the stock market in that specific jurisdiction plays out. So governance here is very important. I see that happening so clearly. Sometimes one global company go into a jurisdiction, and that creates a positive multiplying effect in terms of providing awareness for compliance, for transparency, for state-of-the-art audit practices. In other areas where, say, incomes are very low, the presence of a particular company will help lift GDP per capita, income per capita, and that ends up creating a very important social bonus there. And we should never do away, obviously, with the concept of environment. The other day I was reading a piece at a scientific journal. I said, well, let us forget the E for a while. Let's focus on the S and G. because these are more pressing. No, the E has to be there as well. One thing, and I would not like to mention the example of a single company, but something that I believe that big corporations or some corporations are doing more and more, and something that I particularly like is sometimes we approach the corporation structure, and as we build the different, drawing the different boxes, we'll say, well, this is the legal department here, this is the people's department, we have sales, we have compliance in every way, and then we have the ESG department. It seems to me that if your company is structured in that way, in which you have a single entity, you have a single box that is filled by the ESG, it cannot be seen as a block in itself or as an area in itself, but more as an integrator of ESG considerations throughout the entire corporation structure. It's not something. It's not something. For example, well, okay, great. We got the positive light from legal. Let's now talk to ESG. ESG has to be something that's inseminated and dissipated and pollinized in the different areas of the corporation. I would say it's almost like a state of mind. It's like an attitude, an attitude that is benchmarked by metrics across the entire corporate structure. There's something else that I think it's important to share as well, which is we have to be very careful not to make ESG only a kind of marketing slogan, right? To say that you are in line with the spirit of the times and that your corporation are embracing ESG considerations. It's very important to realize that the playbook for ESG is being written right now, right? The composition is being determined right now. So very important that the private sector engage with the fora where these issues are being discussed, where, say, the constitution of ESG as humanity needs it is being drafted. And it's not something that can be, say, imposed by a group of luminaries to the rest. It has to be a collective construction, and collective not only from the point of view of different geographical or geopolitical realities, but also from different economic actors. And here, I think, corporations must also take center stage.
I think on that note, Marcos, I would like to maybe ask you a question related to your own vision about your role and plans for working with us here at INSEAD at the Hoffman Global Institute for Business Society. Because, as you're saying, the ESG is being, right, rules and general framework is being written now. A lot of it is what we teach, what we research, how we engage with different stakeholders, right? Not only academia, but kind of senior business leaders, senior kind of public policy makers. I mean, what do you envision for your time with us here?
Well, Felipe, I was very much influenced by I don't want to sound too scholarly, but I mean there are two great let's say figureheads of global history, Leonardo Machiavelli and Niccolo Machiavelli, that I'm passionate about, and it's funny because these are two men of the Renaissance. They both are related to Florence and to everything that was happening in Florence in particularly the second half of the 15th century. And there's something that you find in Machiavelli that you find in Leonardo da Vinci as well, which is they understand that distance, whether in painting or whether in writing political theory, favors perspective. Sometimes it's when you step back and you're able to look at things from a particular point of view, that favors your perspective and therefore sharpens your analysis and your capacity to understand. I think the beauty about INSEAD, one of the beauties about INSEAD, is that you have people who are extremely focused on research. They're there looking at the state of the art knowledge of a particular area of business and economics. But then you also have practitioners. You have someone who are out there in the field trying to turn a profit and remunerate investors and shareholders. But then you have people who are also involved in public policies who are trying to define the new rules of the game for the benefit of all. So I've been fortunate. I've been blessed in my professional trajectory in being in government, being in business, and being an academic. And since INSEAD itself as an institution has truly become global, I mean, think about Fontainebleau, think about San Francisco, think about Singapore. I want to make sure that as I move around wearing different hats, at the end of the day, I have something that is useful in terms of how this new chapter of globalization, these new ways of businesses are being defined, to be able to share with the INSEAD community. This is exactly what I want to do.
Excellent, Marcos. We are really honored and delighted that you are working with us. And I'm sure out of this collaboration, there will be a lot of kind of knowledge creation, knowledge dissemination, and kind of engagement in this new chapter of globalization. Marcos, thank you so much.
Thank you, Felipe.